learning of our students properly. Okay, so by the end of this, I hope to empower you to be able to use UDL in your own classroom. So first of all, I want to show you a picture, and I'd like to hear, what do you think is wrong with this picture?
Looks like the student isn't engaged really.
Okay, okay.
And maybe he's struggling with what he's looking at.
Yeah, and this student, not one of my students, but this represents kind of what we see in a lot of our classrooms, especially myself in my 5th period. I have a sheltered biology classroom, and this represents about half my class, and actually at our school it represents more than half of our students who struggle with reading, who aren't engaged because of the tasks or assignments that many of our teachers give them, which is read such and such chapters in a book, write a paper, you know, this assessment. And for a lot of students, it's not really working for them because of their individual learning styles. So what is UDL, you may ask? Well, the individual design for learning in the classroom textbook that I'm reading says UDL is a framework for instruction organized around 3 principles based on learning sciences. These principles guide the design and development of curriculum that is effective and inclusive for all learners. So what does that mean to me? Well, based on that picture I just showed you, a lot of my students obviously differ in the way they learn. And for us, I'm a general population teacher. Inclusion is something that I'm striving for this year, especially with my 5th period sheltered instruction. I want to find ways to be able to include them and any student really in what we're doing in the classroom. So this diagram here kind of goes over how science has shown us that our brains learn differently. So if you look at the highlighted regions there, they are color-coded green, purple, and blue. And what this shows us is that all learners learn differently. The effective networks of the brain, which you can see highlighted in green, kind of show us why students are learning the way they're learning or how they are engaged with what they're learning in the classroom. The purple region there kind of shows us like what they're learning specifically, like what strategies they employ to be able to take in the information you're presenting them. And then the blue strategic network kind of shows us how students are organizing, expressing what it is you ask them to do. So let's say you give Johnny a task. Why should he care about what you're learning if you're not really connecting the lesson to him, right? If you're having him memorize a certain set of facts, well, Johnny's brain may not work the same way. He may not be able to recall the information like you expect him to. And then lastly, how is he learning it? How is he expressing it? Well, if he is not able to, take an information the way that quote-unquote average student would be able to, then you're not really going to connect your lesson to him. So what this means for us is that UDL states that us as educators, we need to be, based on that diagram I showed you, we need to be able to provide students opportunities to learn in multiple means, as the textbook calls it. So first, it states that educators must be able to provide students with multiple means of representation, meaning we need to be able to give them lots of ways to take in information, not just read this chapter. It also means that as educators, we need to provide our students with multiple means of action and expression. What that means for me is if I'm having Johnny read this chapter, I can't just ask him or expect him to be able to write me a 2-page essay like a lot of educators are doing. And then lastly, what that also means is that educators need to be able to provide multiple means of engagement. So in the classroom, that can't just be here, everyone read this chapter. If they're not connecting with the text, if they're not connecting with the story, you're not going to have much buy-in from the student. So what these 3 UDL principles lead us to is what we call, or what UDL textbook refers to as the guidelines based on the UDL principles. And they are all color-coded based on that diagram I showed you earlier, which kind of outlines for us the different ways that we can help students to represent what it is you're asking them, give them ways to express what it is that you're showing them, and give them multiple means to be engaged with what you're teaching them. And I'll go over those a little later. So first of all, what does this mean for us? According to the UDL in the classroom textbook, this means that It's actually the curriculum that is disabled. It's not really the students that are disabled. And here's why. The textbook says, quote, "In traditional settings, we tend to label as disabled or underachieving those individuals whom the curriculum fails, which results in trying to fix these students. Instead, the UDL approach focuses on curricular disabilities because it is the curriculum that cannot meet the learning needs of all students and needs to be fixed." What that means is basically this, is if you are not giving these students those different variations on how they can engage with what they're learning, express what they're learning, and be able to take in that information, it's the way you're teaching that's actually disabled according to the UDL framework. What this means ultimately is that UDL, if implemented correctly, it can help us remove barriers. And barriers in the classroom can be something as simple as like, Johnny, read this chapter. Well, if Johnny doesn't learn the same way that you do, or the way you expect him to, based on how, why, and what students actually learn, then that's a barrier for that student. The UDL textbook states, quote, "UDL reduces barriers in instruction, provides appropriate accommodations, supports and challenges, and maintains high achievement expectations for all students, including students with disabilities, students whom are English proficient." Now, in my classroom, like I said, I have a large population of English language learners. A lot of them are newcomers to the country, and this applies to them, and for many students at our classroom, I believe. So that's how I think that UDL can help us remove barriers for our students. And once we remove those barriers, of course, this should naturally lead to differentiation for all students. The UDL textbook states, quote, "Research from neuroscience has helped us to understand that even students who appear to be similar are actually quite different. Since no two students are the same, the whole curriculum must capably address the strengths and weaknesses of individual students as they move collectively toward high achieving standards." So basically what that means is if you are implementing UDL appropriately, you should be able to meet the needs of your gifted to SPED to English learner to any student. So that's ultimately the goal of UDL, is that it works for all. Because there is no one-size-fits-all student, there is no average student. But the problem is a lot of us kind of design our curriculum for an average student, and there really is no such thing. So how can we use these guidelines as a tool? Well, what it does for myself and for you is basically it gives you a way to meet the needs of any learner in your classroom, because again, all students do learn differently. So based on that, the CAST or UDL website gives us kind of ways that we can give students opportunities. And if you are following each of those three principles that I stated earlier, which is giving students multiple means of representation, well, if you are following those principles, what that means for you is you're giving students opportunities to reach higher levels of comprehension, right? You're giving them ways to understand the symbols, and especially in a science class or a math class, there's a lot of terminology that maybe the average, or in my case, my make-believe student Johnny won't be able to access the same way. So if you're following the UDL guidelines, you're giving him ways to understand what those symbols mean. You're also giving them ways to take in that information and perceive, what needs to be learned for your particular goal. If you are following the principle of multiple means of action and expression, well, in a classroom that is following these UDL frameworks, then you're giving students multiple opportunities to express what it is they're learning from you. You're giving them ways to act out or recite information to you, rather than just like on an essay, for example. It gives them ways to respond in the classroom physically. So if in any UDL classroom you'll see students engage differently, maybe they'll be doing an activity or a lab, or maybe doing oral presentations rather than just writing and lecturing all day. If we follow the principle of multiple means of engagement, then you're giving students an opportunity to kind of engage themselves with the learning, rather than just sitting in a classroom where they're hearing lecture for an hour a day. If you follow the UDL framework properly, you're then giving students ways to kind of regulate their own pace, their own learning, and ultimately what that does for you is, and for the student, is they'll be more engaged and they'll be more motivated with what you're teaching them in the classroom, and they'll be interested. The CAST website offers kind of these checkpoints for us as educators. So if we are following these different guidelines, then what the website does, it offers us ways to make sure that, for example, if you're wanting to know how students are taking in what it is you're teaching them, well, it offers a checkpoint for representation. And what that gives you is it gives us as teachers ways to customize how we're displaying information in the classroom. So for example, if you have a student who maybe doesn't take in or process information the way that you assume that they do, it gives us ideas for how to present them. So maybe they could have a textbook on their iPad that is like text-to-speech. They could have maybe a lot of visuals or a lot of animations that they can use on their iPads rather than just reading a textbook. The website also offers action and expression ways for you to make sure that students aren't just doing the norm in the classroom, which is, you know, write a research paper or something like that. It gives us opportunities to kind of vary up how we have them present information to us, and it gives them lots of opportunities to use technology in the classroom, such as iPads like we have at our school, as a means of communication. And then lastly, the website also offers ways to make sure that we are engaging our students. So if you don't know if your lesson is like a UDL lesson, then it gives you ways to make sure you're giving students choice in the lessons you're teaching them. It also offers up opportunities for us to teach them how to reflect upon themselves. And ultimately what that does is it keeps the students more engaged in what they are learning. So what we can do with UDL is it gives us opportunities to make formative and summative assessments, and here's why. So at our school, which you may know, we are a pathway linked learning type of school. So if we're following this UDL approach, rather than just kind of teaching to content standards and we're teaching more for like mastery of our skills, for example, UDL is a perfect fit. And here's why. Because if we're following this UDL framework, it's going to give us assessments that are ongoing, for one. So instead of measuring if Johnny is able to define what this is or write an essay on that, now our assessments can kind of be ongoing, right? We're seeing if they are the standards are measurable, or is he accomplishing the skill we want him to from beginning to end. And again, like I said, we're not focusing so much on content, we're more focusing on competency of the students' learning, and that's really what's important and sets UDL apart. And it's flexible, that's what's great, because like I said, students learn differently. They learn differently in what you're teaching, why you're teaching it, and they learn differently. So what that does is it actively involves all students in what you're teaching them. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, does this work for all? How much time will it take? There are pros and cons to this, and as I was doing my own research, I was thinking, you know, what would it take for me to implement this in my classroom or in all my classrooms, not just my 5th period? So some pros that I gathered that I think I covered with you is that, for one, UDL would reduce barriers, obviously, for any student if followed properly. It also offers up a way for teachers to differentiate for student A all the way to student Z. If followed correctly, you'll design lessons that are more effective because, again, you're not just focusing on one way to teach a student or one way for a student to present information to you. And the assessments are authentic, right? Rather than just focusing on like a standard, like I said, we're focusing more on how students learn. The cons, of course, I'm not a SPED teacher. I don't have all the resources available, I think, at this school, or the time to sit down with, you know, 5 individual students. So for me, I see the barrier, for me personally, is time. I have classrooms of up to 35 students, and to be able to do this effectively, there's a little bit of time challenge. I'm not saying it's impossible. Of course, you know, with given enough planning time or enough PD time, I think that any of us could implement UDL. Technology. So in order for UDL to work, like I was saying earlier, there are UDL textbooks that are available, like on iPads. But not all schools have those resources at their disposal. And class sizes. I have some classes that are very large, so UDL is not really meant to be a checklist per se. It's more like a list of options that us as teachers can utilize to reach, again, any learner. So, you know, there's challenges, I think, but the pros outweigh the cons is really what I foresee. And especially at this school, I spoke with Ms. Montoya, our counselor, and she shared with me these statistics. The demographics of our city, Glassell Park, which is the city where I teach, the Sotomayor Center for Arts and Sciences. We are a Title I school, and that is because almost 100% of our students qualify for reduced meal plans. The community around the surrounding school is 93% Latino, and many of our students, including my fifth period, are non-English speakers. A lot of them are newcomers to the country. Our school, according to the data that our counselors presented me, we're at a 97.6 poverty rate, and we have several at-risk students. We offer many services like Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, and lots of gang intervention and outside resources like therapists that we offer because of the need of our populations. And of course we have many SPED students at our school. So I think this is a perfect fit for our population. And again, here's just a couple of references that I use to cite my work. But again, ultimately I think that UDL is a good fit for our school. And I think that after this presentation, you are now able to utilize and implement UDL in the classroom.
Okay.
Any questions?
So UDL is supposed to help every student in every single class. How do you then use one of the strategies for representation to help a student, like let's say you have a student that's very advanced, gifted student, that would reach their understanding, but at the same time you're trying to accommodate for a student who maybe doesn't understand English as well?
Well, the thing with how we represent a lesson is that many of the curriculum that we utilize, it's kind of geared towards this make-believe average student, where we assume that, say the textbook, for example, that we have in this classroom, it's written at grade level for a high school reader, but most of our students at this school are not at grade level. So the problem is that if we're all teaching according to that text, we're actually doing a disservice to students on either end of the spectrum. So in order to use UDL correctly, we have to differentiate, right? So we're not going to just teach to student A or student C, we're actually going to try to teach to individual students. So it wouldn't be the same assignment for all. So something that I like to do in my classroom is, as you can see, my classroom is split up into pods. Every Thursday, Friday, what I like to do is I like to give them different ways to take in information. So on a Thursday, Friday, when I do my labs, I set up stations. One station, they'll be doing some sort of hands-on activity. Another station, they'll be doing some sort of like reading activity. And then another station, they'll be doing like, you know, some sort of like warm-up or group discussion. So for me, what that means is just offering up different ways to, you know, perceive that content. So I'm not just going to teach one way to my gifted or to my SPED or to a NEAL student, right? Because that would be a one-size-fits-all for those three types of students. But that's not the way we should be teaching. We should be giving different ways to take in that information. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for your time.